midsummer of our second COVID year, we think we'd like to encounter the celebratory richness of our world. And so welcome to this program on international fairs and festivals featuring Helfgott, Renee Laegreid, and Dilnoza Khasilova. And I'm going to introduce them just each individually before their talks. And I should say that while it's international fairs and festivals, you can assume that there will be a twist or many twists because this is, after all, academia. Now, Helfgott will be talking about the art of the fair, international expositions, global exchange, and the birth of the modern museum blockbuster. Dr. Helfgott was educated at Swarthmore and Harvard and joined UW in 2009 after teaching at Georgetown and the University of Toronto. She has a long involvement with all aspects of the Global Engagement Office, including taking UW students on study abroad courses and doing CGS-funded work with museums in Cambodia and India. Today, she is the Vice Provost for Global Engagement. So she's the person who helps all of this happen. And she's Associate Professor still of History and American Studies because they don't want to let her go. Her work takes a historical perspective on the production, collecting, and public dissemination of art. And her first book, Framing the Audience, Art and Politics and Culture in the United States from 1929 to 45, examined the broad expansion of fine art into popular culture during the Great Depression and World War II. But her talk today is based on preliminary research for her next book, which investigates the evolution of fine art exhibitions at World's Fairs in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So Lisa, over to you.
Because there's literally nothing I would rather talk about all afternoon than art exhibitions at World's Fairs. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Caroline, for that nice introduction and for letting me come and participate instead of just watching passively from the background, and for giving me a chance to dust off some of my research notes, which have lain a little bit dormant over this past year since I took on the administrative role in the Global Engagement Office, which is a great thrill of my life. To work with Caroline and the CGS staff is really just a tremendous privilege. And how nice to see all of you here. It's a much nicer day than last time we gathered, so thanks for coming out. So, as Caroline mentioned, what I'm going to talk about today is the basis of my next book project, which is about the long history of fine art exhibitions, blockbuster art exhibitions at World's Fairs, from the late 19th century through 1964. So far I've had a hard stop at the New York World's Fair of 1964. Has anyone here been to a World's Fair? Yeah. Anybody go to the art exhibitions at the World's Fair that you went to? So I went to a World's Fair in 1986 in Vancouver. I'm from Bellingham, Washington. And I thought it was amazing. And in fact, these fairs were supposed to amaze. They were supposed to amaze and inspire, and literally, like this picture, can you see it okay? From the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876, literally to bring the hubris, to bring the entire world to one place, to exchange ideas, to be amazed. And historians love fairs. There's been a resurgence in fair scholarship over the last few years, which is thrilling. They tend to focus on a set of issues that came up at the fairs. They talk about the impact on the urban environments in which the fairs are made, so remaking cities in places like Paris and Chicago. They talk about the commercial impact. There was a lot of consumer products like Wrigley's Spearmint Gum and pre-made pancake batter that were introduced at World's Fairs. And so the commercial impact of these in terms of the consumer economy was quite big. They had a huge impact on amusements in general. They brought electric lights into the public sphere. They made it possible for people to be out at night. They brought things like the Ferris wheel, mechanical amusements. They inspired Coney Island and the amusement parks of the turn of the century, which live with us today in modified form with Disneyland. And then they also, a lot of historians are quite interested in the way that World's Fairs represented ideas about other people and other places. People traveled, goods traveled, stuff moved around, and with them came a lot of ideas about individual and group and nation's place in a larger global economy. That's the part that really interests me, the way that stuff and ideas and perceptions of each other really proliferated at these World's Fairs and were really strongly influenced by the fairs. For those of you who have been to the fairs, do you have a pretty good memory of what the experience was like? Yeah. For a lot of people who went, they were extremely powerful. For me, I can remember what the Expo 86 smelled like, what the weather was like, what I was wearing, what my mother was wearing. They were very powerful experiences. So, but one of the things historians have talked less about, and maybe Dr. Laegreid will fill some of this in after I speak later today, is the impact of World's Fairs on cultural citizenship. And that's really where my focus is. And today I thought I would talk just a little bit about these enormous art exhibitions, which were the focus of my research, but specifically the way that they laid the groundwork for what is today the modern blockbuster museum exhibition. There was a Monet exhibition in Denver last year. I would call that a blockbuster exhibition. These are exhibitions in museums where they bring work from around the world around a theme that they think will have popular resonance. And my argument is that really in World's Fairs is where we see the genesis of the idea that fine art could resonate with a popular audience. And that had repercussions for how art functioned in the broader political conversations about nations, about relationships between nations, and about perceptions of other people. So I thought I would just do a couple bookends. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition in 1876, and then at the end I'll come back to the New York World's Fair of 1939, which is really where my heart lies because I'm a New Deal era historian by training. So these two pictures, am I allowed to do this? These two pictures, if you can see them, show the main art gallery, Memorial Hall, at the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876. Underneath, you can see the opening ceremonies from that day. And I just give you that image to show you how many people were there. Millions of people came to these exhibitions. Remember that there were no real art museums in the United States in 1876. And in fact, one of the big impacts of World's Fair art exhibitions was in providing the genesis for museums in cities, London, the Victoria and Albert Museum from the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Chicago Art Institute and the Field Museum in Chicago, lots of the museums, the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. A lot of the museums that we take for granted had their genesis in the popularity of the art exhibitions at the fairs earlier on. The artwork itself got some nice press coverage in the Philadelphia and in the national press, and if you can see, there were approximately 7,000 works of art. They had to build an extra building for the art exhibition in Philadelphia. They were stacked 10 feet high, and I forget the number, but something like 25,000 linear feet of art exhibition space in Philadelphia. And you can see on the right is the British Pavilion, and on the left is just the General Hall. These are some of my favorite things. The Library of Company of Philadelphia has an enormous collection of 6 stereographs, and they'll actually let you put them in a stereograph viewer, so you can see some of these exhibitions in 3D, but this is the American exhibition from Philadelphia again. I'm a picture person, so I feel like you guys have to see some pictures. And this one's a little bit interesting. Exhibit B shows you all the countries where the artwork came from, and you can't see it very well. I can't even see it very well, but it gives the number of square feet for each country, from the United States at the top to Japan with 0 at the bottom. And then on the left, you can see the layout. So one of the things that's interesting about this to me is that they had all of these paintings, they were organized geographically. For this exhibition, the US government sent a naval vessel, the Supply, to Europe, literally going around all the ports in Europe, collecting artworks, both American artworks and artworks that were being exhibited by European national pavilions. I would say governments, but only some of them were organized by governments. And so there were, of these 7,000 artworks, approximately 2,000 were American and 5,000 were European, mostly European. There were actually a handful of things from Japan, but they were photographs. You're not going to be able to see this at all. So I'll tell you what it is. This is an address from an artist society to its members. They met to talk about the implications of the fine art exhibition at the Centennial Exposition. And the highlighted part in red basically says, look, Europe is sending its best artwork. We American artists have to up our game, and we have to make sure that we can essentially compete. The American exhibition at the American offerings at the 1876 show were widely derided by European press. And the sense that the United States had to up its game and compete culturally on the world stage was really important. But at the same time, one of the things that's very interesting to me about these exhibitions is that really what they did is they established a canon of art. So the same objects sometimes would come in 1876, as came in 1893, as came in 1933, as came in 1939. These were masterpieces of art. It was the best stuff. It had to be worth it for you to come to the art exhibition instead of riding the Ferris wheel or eating exotic foods like a hot dog, which also premiered apparently in one of these fairs. So anyway, the artists were really conscious of the significance that was imbued in these art exhibitions, and they were trying to tell their peers, this is important, take it seriously. So now briefly, I'm just going to move forward to 1939 as a little bookend. What you're looking at here in my opening picture is an image from Anton Refrigier's mural in the WPA Pavilion, the central area of the WPA Pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair in New York. I'll give you a little bit of a sense of scale there. That's the opening ceremonies. FDR opened the ceremonies in 1939, but on the right, you're right, is just to give you a sense of scale of how big that image was. If you take a minute to look at this image, what's happening here, and again, this is the WPA Pavilion, so this is about the impact of the US government on society. What you have is a builder building a wall, and before the building is even finished, you have a sculptor putting up the decoration and a painter starting a mural. The message here is that art was really integral to America. The builder is integral, but art is integral too. And I would argue that the World's Fairs were trying to make that same argument in putting forward these big fine art exhibitions. So the main art attraction was the Masterpiece of Art building. You can see on your right the arrival of Goya's portrait of Don Louis de Sistu as a child. And you can see I just like all of the people lined up there to welcome this painting. It was a big event. It was an event that had a photographer there to welcome this Goya painting to the United States. We didn't have a lot of this stuff here, and we didn't have a lot of it on display. So this was the fair officials making this cultural heritage, these masterpieces of art, the best of the best, available to the American viewers. And there was an American painting at the Masterpieces of Art exhibition. And you can't read it. In fact, I'm going to go down here to remember what it says. It was included as an innovation in this year's Masterpieces of Art exhibition. So this is the famous portrait of George Washington. And the Americans were very excited that it was included, but that wasn't enough to, that wasn't enough to placate the American artists who were really pissed off that there were no plans to include contemporary American art at the 1939 World's Fair. And if you remember, about the 1930s, everybody was protesting in the 1930s. The American artists put up enough of a fuss that they actually built a contemporary art building, and they had over 1,000 artworks by American artists also at the fair. I'm going to go back to that. Here's just to give you a sense of how big it was. This picture here, American artists sent their works and they literally poured into the headquarters for juries. There was a lot of politics around what kind of artwork was ultimately chosen and criticism, but there were a lot of American artworks available for people to see at the fair. These are 2 pages from Life magazine's coverage of the Golden Gate exposition in 1939. There were warring World's Fairs in the United States in 1939. And alas, you can't really see it, but on the right it says $20 million shipment of Italian art goes to San Francisco Fair with armed guards. That's the headline. And on the left it says, director treks 30,000 miles to get best US art for Golden Gate Fair. And the point I'm trying to make here is that there was a lot of hoopla about these art exhibitions. And so people did in fact go, and at some of these fairs you actually had to pay extra to see the artwork, and they did. Also at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, the International Business Machines Corporation, under the directorship of Thomas J. Watson, who was also on the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, had their own exhibition of 75 art of 79 countries. IBM was putting its mark here. IBM was saying, art is important. We're going to recognize that Americans should be culturally literate, and you don't need to go to the government pavilion, and you don't even need to go to the museum pavilion. You can come to the IBM pavilion and see the artwork here. And that exhibition was made into a very lovely glossy book. And also on your right is a picture of a flyer for that exhibition in Salt Lake City, Utah, so this IBM made its blockbuster exhibition a national phenomenon and sent it on tours. And lastly, just to 1503. One of the points that I have here is really the way that these World's Fairs brought fine art into the sphere of commerce and into discussions about national identity, but also how national identity was very much implicated in the expansion of American businesses. And so this is one of my favorite modern examples of that. Blockbuster exhibitions are really expensive. The US Navy no longer sends a vessel to Europe to collect paintings to bring them back here, usually. So what you have instead are blockbuster exhibitions that are really not only sponsored, but really enabled by corporate sponsorship. And this is an exhibition of Jasper Johns that I saw at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. in 2007. The banner just gives you a sense of how big the scale was of the exhibition. And you can't really see, this is from the museum bulletin. That's a picture of Jasper Johns with his Target painting behind him. And underneath it talks about how the exhibition is proudly sponsored by the Target Corporation, which bears a very striking resemblance to the actual artwork in there. So if I had more time, I would go to greater depths to convince you that the genesis of this kind of thing, this implication, making it worth the Target Corporation's time to sponsor an exhibition, that genesis is in the World's Fairs that started in London in 1851 and made their way through the 20th century. So that's all. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you very much, Isa. We're going to have an opportunity to ask questions when all of the presentations have been completed. But I also want to share this with you, actually, to just send around as we're discussing that sheet right there. Because we're really interested in what's interesting to Centennials. So the sheet that's coming around is going to invite you to put down your name and your email if you'd like to stay in touch with us and be up to date on programs and so on. But it also invites you to make suggestions about what you would like to see us bring in terms of international discussions and so on to Centennial in the future. So please do look at that and do give us your suggestions, even if you don't want to give us your email. We're just as interested in your suggestions. So now I want to move on, and we'll be welcoming Renee Laegreid. Renee is going to be talking about Buffalo Bill's Wild West in Italy. So this is very much America's international connections and activities today. And why Buffalo Bill's Wild West in Italy matters. Renee Laegreid is a professor of history of the U.S. West at the University of Wyoming, and she pursues research in two areas, one of which takes an international turn. The first area is women and gender in the 20th century West, and there her publications include Women on the North American Plains and Riding Pretty, Rodeo Royalty in the American West. And she's also a series editor for Women in the American West. Her second area of research, and the one she's going to talk to us today about, is Buffalo Bill in Italy. And Dr. Laegreid has served as an associate editor of the letters of the William Cody Project with the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody. Her essay, The Legacy of the West in 20th Century Italy, won the Western Heritage Award, and her chapter, Buffalo Bill, the Italian Hero of the Prairies, a fascist twist on Americanization in Italy, was included in the anthology The Popular Frontier, Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Transatlantic Mass Culture. And she's currently working on a book on the idea of the cowboy in the U.S. and Italy. So, Renee Laegreid to talk about Buffalo Bill in Italy.
Thank you very much. And again, thanks for inviting me out here. Like Issa, I could talk forever on this topic. And so, unlike Issa, though, I'm not nearly as disciplined. And so I write everything out because if I don't, then I will go on forever. But I just want to mention Buffalo Bill has a very important connection with world fairs. At the Chicago 1983 World Fair, Frederick Jackson Turner was up giving a paper, a very long, incredibly boring paper in a very hot room with no ventilation about how the frontier had ended. And right outside, not with the World's Fair, but outside of it, Buffalo Bill was starting his was giving a performance on the Wild West and really helping originate the myth, perpetuate the myth of the American West that became so widely popular. So anyway, it's too bad that this doesn't. Here we go. Okay. I hope you can see some of these. There's not a whole lot of detail, but I first heard about Buffalo Bill in Italy about 20 years ago when my husband and I took the kids to Italy to meet my relatives over there. And I was still working on my dissertation, and my uncle asked me, "Oh, what are you writing about?" And I said, "Oh, women in rodeo." And he said, "Buffalo Bill was in Italy, and our cowboys beat your cowboys." And I was like, "What?" I had never heard about this before. And it took me a long time to get back to this topic, but this is really what got me going. It was that family connection. And what I find really interesting about Cody taking a show to Italy wasn't that he took a show to Italy, because he took a show all over the place, but how his show informed and shaped Italians' view of America and how long his memory has persisted in Italy. They still talk about him. And how a bucking contest in Rome became a metaphor for how Italians critique, and in some cases still do critique, America today. Oh, here we go. So, Cody's arrival in Rome was part of an extended European tour. His first international trip had occurred a few years later when he went to England, and he performed in London alongside the Queen's Jubilee, which was her 50th anniversary celebration. And again, this idea of performing alongside, he wasn't part of the Jubilee, just like he wasn't part of the World's Fair, but he'd kind of sidle up to something that was going on because that would attract more visitors to his show. But anyway, the trip went really well. He met royalty, he gave a command performance for the Queen, and the number of people who flocked to his shows as he took his show around England made sure it was financially very, very good for him too. So when he got back to the States, he immediately started putting together plans for a new extended tour. And this one was, again, going to go back to England, but then go to Scotland and France, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ukraine. So he was very ambitious about this. So he arrived in January of 1890 in Naples, and then moved northward to Rome, Florence, Bologna, Milan, and then Verona. And again, just as he had coordinated his other shows to be alongside and glom onto crowds, he did that in Rome as well. He arranged to be there to overlap with the annual anniversary of Pope Leo VIII's coronation. And so he expected that Rome would not only be filled with locals but visitors, and he hoped that they would all be wanting to see some secular as well as some sacred spectacle. So for folks who study Buffalo Bill, his international tours are really important. They demonstrate his use of modern technology for logistics, delve into his personal correspondence, they look at his advertising strategies, the colleagues and connections he made. But his tour is important for me because I want to understand how Italians understood Cody. And in 1890, the Italian population as a whole knew very little about the United States, perhaps a lot less than most other countries. Italy had been politically oriented via the nation state, and it had only been unified as a country since 1861. So Italians really had very little reason to invest any interest in the United States. And then too, there's a high illiteracy rate amongst Italians. So even if they had heard about the United States, their knowledge of the United States was probably based really on, some rumors, some phrases, some bits of letters home that someone had received. So when Cody and his troupe arrived in Italy, he helped bring these very diverse and spotty images into focus that centered on the American West. But as a representative of the American West, he also de facto became a representative of the United States as a whole. Now this image here, if you can see it very well, is in Germany. I didn't have a good aerial image or high image of the one in Rome, but it's pretty much the same thing. And you can see it was a really large setup with the stadiums, and then off to the side they have what they call the annex, and that's where the Native Americans and the other people, performers, would live. And spectators could go and they could wander around the annex and talk to Indians, and they could meet Annie Oakley, and they could do all these things. They could look at American horses and cattle. But this is really where it gets interesting, because the Italians were fascinated with Cody, and newspapers covered his show extensively. And from reading the newspapers, you get two very distinct views that emerge. And the first, of course, is a very positive view. People are just so excited to see him here. There is really little to do. And so, a show like this coming to town, a window into the American West, into America, people wanted to see this. And so the Italians who had heard good things about Cody, who had heard good things about the U.S., rushed to see, the new world performing in the old world. And one of the things that helped was really spur interest is that by 1890, nearly 160,000 people a year were leaving Italy. About half that number were going to the United States. And so Letters Home had provided that peek into a world that beckoned with opportunity. That immigrants who returned home, as perhaps half of the immigrants who came to the U.S. did go back to their home countries. They told about hard work, but they said this hard work offered a higher standard of living, if not well, and the possibility of enjoying a higher social status than you could get in Italy's very rigid social hierarchy. So Cody meant to impress spectators with his historical perspective of Western history, rather than inspire immigration. His own story of an impoverished rural worker who rose to wealth and fame reinforced the idea that America was a land of opportunity, and his story appealed to the masses, showing that America truly was the promised land. So, Cody, so the majority of Italians just, welcomed Cody. The elites had a different view of him. They gave him a much chillier reception. For the elites, it wasn't illiteracy that hindered their knowledge of the United States, but it was their lack of interest, if not outright contempt. Because in their view, America was an uncivilized, unimportant country. Why bother? And worse, the American democratic system threatened their very social structure. Italian elites' interaction with immigrants who had returned home reinforced their worst fears. They saw the U.S. as an increasing threat to established institutions, to the authority of the family, the church, the state, and above all, a threat to class structure. As you can see in this quote right here, they're complaining that, my God, these peasants who leave come back and they don't respect us at all. We must put a stop to that. We can't have this. There we go. So in my research, the newspapers covering Cody's tour was, incredibly valuable. Again, the coverage is extensive. He got 3, 4, 5 articles on him and his show every day. And readers could learn all about Cody, all about his show, what he's doing. They could learn about the Native Americans. It's on the right. There's Native Americans in their traditional dress having coffee, going for a cafe at one of the shops. And they could see pictures of Annie Oakley. And again, think for a very traditional country, the idea of a woman performing, and so you know about this too, that people who perform, especially women, that's kind of a tawdry reputation, but Oakley could pull it off by adhering to very strict traditional standards of womanhood. So she pulled it off, and wow, look at her riding that horse, and side saddle. So this is, the photography, it really helped show, to the masses what a cool thing, what a cool place America and the West was. And Cody managed to get an audience with the Pope for his Native American performers, which was an unimaginable honor for everyone, and the coverage on that was just amazing. People just went nuts about this. Now, the second theme that emerged was using Cody as a vehicle to make fun of themselves. And there's all these little cartoons that are just adorable. My favorite one was a cartoon of these 2 women, very well-dressed women, walking down the street, and they see a picture of Cody, and one of them says, "Oh my, what a handsome man." And the other one says, "Yes, and if you have one of those horned beasts that needs taming, he can do that and return him meek as a lamb." And so the first one says, "Really? Well, I'll bring my husband to him straight away." But they also use cartoons to use Cody as a way to critique their politicians and their policies. And they were especially quick to connect Cody, who presented himself as the vanguard of American civilization, helping colonize the West, when they were very unhappy with the Prime Minister's Crispy's plan to colonize Africa. And they connected the two very, very strongly and very pointedly. That image of a rifle-toting, fringe-coated Cody served as a very useful tool, and they were absolutely brutal in trying to point out the inhumanity of going to another country and trying to take over other people's lands without the proper support that the president had, or the prime minister had promised, but he is failing them. And the third theme that emerges from looking at the newspapers is an outright disdain for Cody. Again, this is from the elites and the intellectuals, and while it was less common than what you see in the other forms of newspaper coverage, it was definitely there. And one reporter had provided an unusually harsh critique of Cody when he first opened in Rome, saying that the writers were second-rate and the show was repetitive and the whole thing was delusion, don't waste your money. And others, pointedly asked the Italians, we're proud of our history, our art, our architecture, literature, and music. And what does Buffalo Bill and his troop have to offer? I mean, they're just barbarians in rough dress. And who do you think you are, Buffalo Bill? You plebe, hanging out with our aristocracy and pretending you're as good as we are. And so, again, you get this real class-based analysis of the Italian view of Cody by looking through these sources. Now, maybe all of this would have just disappeared if Cody had just left, but an event happened, and it's one of those historical moments that crystallized Cody into the memory of Italian. And that event was a bucking contest that became known as La Sfida, which just means the challenge. And this is what my uncle told me about, 100 years later. So La Sfida began as a single contest between Cody and the Duke of Sermonata, who had a very large estate south of Rome. And so this first contest was between the Duke's wild horses, these wild colts, and the Native Americans, because the Duke had heard that Native Americans were fabulous riders, but could they ride his horses? He didn't think so. And, Cody was always getting into these contests at all of his fairs. One thing, they would advertise them, and that would bring more people into a show. And the second, he never made a bet that he thought he could actually lose, because he didn't have the money to pay off the bets. So it worked for him both ways. Now, the newspapers were very excited about this, and they talked about the contest, and the terms were very simple. The Duke would supply these wild horses, and if Cody's riders, Native Americans, could catch, saddle, mount, and ride the colts to a standstill, Cody won the bet and the horses. If his riders failed, he had to pay out 10,000 lira, which I think nowadays is like $5, to feed the poor. But the native riders, fortunately for him, did really well, impressed the crowds, and Cody got these two beautiful horses. So immediately now there's consternation. Well, how well can these cowboys ride? So this bet was whether or not Cody's cowboys could ride the Duke's wild horses. And this time, the conversation in the newspaper wasn't so much about how are the Native Americans going to do it. I mean, if you want to ask me about this conversation, it's great, and I can talk to that. But with the cowboys, it was a form of cultural comparison, connecting the two cattle herders, the Butri, which I'll talk about in a second, with the American cowboys, and the attributes of each of their countries. So Italian cowboys, or Butri, tended cattle in it's in the western marshlands of Italy, since about before the Romans. And they were part of the traditional social structure. They're agricultural workers, they worked on large estates, but in terms of hierarchy on the estates, they were fairly high up because they had these special skills working with horses and cattle. Now, Cody's cowboys actually succeeded in bucking out the colts, but the newspaper coverage focused on how the cowboys did this, which the Italians considered barbaric and cruel. They lassoed the colts, they threw them to the ground, shoved a bit in their mouth, got the saddles mostly on. When the horses were struggling to get up, they girthed them, and then the cowboy jumped on it and bucked them out. Now, the spectators, of course, were going crazy. They're like, yeah, this is the most exciting thing we've ever seen. But the reporters and the Butri who had brought the horses in were just absolutely shocked. They saw this brutal and barbaric, which they attributed to character flaws in Americans. And, the journalists took special note on how the Butri who watched the performance were disgusted at the treatment of the horses. So this leads to the third and final contest, the Italian Butri attempting to ride the wild colts. And this is a contest that did not go smoothly. So according to the Italian newspaper, and I'll read the quote here, 8 Butri from the Roman countryside presented themselves at Buffalo Bill's arena, bringing with them wild colts. They saddled and mounted too, without the same aids used by the cowboys, meaning lassos and blindfolds. They were ready to take the third colt to the party when Mr. Buffalo Bill intervened, saying the contest was over. What? What time limit? They said there was no time limit, and Buffalo Bill, who was afraid he was going to lose his bet, said, "There's a time limit. The contest is over. I win." So this shows the 2 points of contention that continued to surface for over 100 years: the American method of handling the colts and the confusion over time limit, which leads to a whole new battle between the U.S. and Italian newspapers over the true victors of the competition. The Americans insisted that Cody's writers won, saying the time limit had been clearly stated, and the Italian press's, quote, "for reasons best not inquired into, had been from the first inimical to Cody, writing things both libelous and scurrilous," unquote. And for a brief moment, the American cowboys were heroes in American papers, like for a day. Now, according to the Italian newspapers, the Butri one, they argued Cody had not announced a time limit, the start before, and therefore it was arbitrary to stop it. And, quote, "victory remains to the Butri, always and for the ages." And then the press started describing Cody as a buffoon, a cheat, and a swindler who ran away without paying his debt of honor, unquote. So they valorized, they valorized Augusto Imperali, this cowboy right there with his hat, as a real cowboy, authentic, upholding centuries of tradition, honorable, while dissing Cody's cowboys as pretend or show cowboys who had been constructed by Cody from just working class stiffs just to be part of his show. They're not the real deal. And so critics used the competition to vent their anger at Cody's arrogance, and which they saw was an extension of American arrogance, making this both a political and cultural issue. So I'll end by saying that, this contest between the new and old world cowboys, each, of course, side claimed victory, and the Americans claimed victory. Their victory proved the superiority of new world youthfulness, skill, and brute strength. The Italians won, they said, proving the superiority of old world traditions and knowing and honor and following, traditional ways. Now, the Americans forgot this story almost immediately. It became part of the Italian memory, and intellectuals, journalists, and elites to this day still use the competition, the sfida, as a way to critique America, which I find really interesting. And it comes in various and sundry forms, but they go back to this exhibition, these contests, as ways of showing that America's attitudes and culture are far inferior to the Italian ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. And our third person this afternoon is Dilnoza Khasilova, who's going to talk about the customs and costumes. It was costumes and customs, I remember, of Uzbekistan. And Dilnoza is our colleague also in the Global Engagement Office. She's been project coordinator with us for a while. And she founded and directs the Access the World with World Languages and Culture program, which is a Wyoming nonprofit. And if you are interested in learning, I don't know, how many languages now, Dilnoza? 20. This is a really interesting program. I participated in it myself. My smattering of Arabic comes from really wonderful experiences in that program. And it's a weekly engagement with a native speaker. And they're very generous and kind, which I've much appreciated. But I strongly recommend it. And we were doing it, of course, online this year, so it's available to everybody who would like to do it. Dr. Khasilova holds a UW PhD in Literacy Studies, Curriculum and Instruction, and a BA in Linguistics and Foreign Languages from the Smolensk University for Humanities. She was born in Russia, but she grew up in Uzbekistan, in Central Asia. And she is an ambassador of Central Asia on campus here, and she serves as advisor to the Central Asian Students Association. She is also a dancer and organizes campus cultural events to celebrate our international diversity. And recently, Dilnoza's work was recognized with the Pacific Northwest Friends of Languages Award and the Wyoming Foreign Language Teachers Association. I've got them mixed up, haven't I? No, that's right. Friend of Foreign Languages Award. Her work on teaching the Uzbek language and culture across the U.S. was recognized by the Cabinet of the President and Ministry of Uzbekistan. And you can always bet that when Dilnoza is involved, there will be music, and there will also be dancing. I'll just say there's a lot of equipment and there's a lot of cables, so watch out. But
thank you, Caroline, for the beautiful introduction. And I would like to thank our two presenters. I learned a lot from your presentations. It was super interesting. And now from American West, I want to travel with you to Silk Road country, which is called Uzbekistan. So I did bring the map here to show you that it's a little country located in Central Asia. And we have 5 stan countries. It's one of the stan's country. And I know people usually ask me if I'm from Pakistan, and I say, no, I'm sorry, I'm from Uzbekistan. So, and then Uzbekistan has really tiny cities as well. And when I will be talking today about festivals, and I'll be showing in my presentation, so I'll have 2 parts of my presentation. It would be talking about the festivals, and I think when we talk, it's better to show you how it looks like when you travel to Uzbekistan and attending those festivals. It will be a part of dancing as well. So in Uzbekistan, when you travel to different cities across the country, you will be traveling as if you're going to a new world, because the culture is different, the people are different. We have Persians, we have Afghani people, we have Iranian people who live in Samarkand and Bukhara, and you can see it here, right here, south. Bukhara and Samarkand are really famous cities. They are located in, we call them Silk Road cities. So any festival or any event in Uzbekistan, including conferences, goes with music and dance. So although Renee was talking about how it's not appropriate to dance or for people to be a dancer, it's the same in Uzbekistan, but it's part of the culture of people. When they listen to music, they cannot stop. They just go and dance. So when you travel, feel free to dance and just, join the concept. So this is one of the biggest events I'll be talking, famous Shakt Taronalara. People around the world come to this festival. It's held once in 2 years, and then 2 years, and then people usually present their culture and music. So although I'm not talking about my research exactly, because this is about Uzbekistan, but my research is connected. I love doing ethnographic work, so I do look at cultures, how people learn languages, so that's part of my research. One of the biggest festivals that are actually, I think, known in Wyoming pretty well, Nowruz, Central Asian New Year, which is celebrated on March 21st. And this event goes with music again, dancing, and food. So food is a big part of the culture. When we talk about customs and costumes, as you can see, my topic is really connected. So we're talking about costumes that I'm wearing right now. Costumes are part of customs, and customs are part of festivals. So they're really connected. So this is how they cook during, this is actually the proof. When you see we have instruments, people are dancing, they are, wearing their beautiful clothes. Again, people from different cities wear their traditional clothing. Right now I'm wearing, I would say, more Fergana Valley dressing that is, known for their adras and atlas, the material. And people usually cook sumalak. You boil the sumalak for 24 hours during the whole night, and by the morning it's ready like a chocolate. It's really yummy and tasty. And I was unfortunate to be here during COVID, because people say when you eat sumalak it helps your immune system. So. And again, this is, you can see lots of colors, different colors. We do produce silk.
So lots of food. Again, this is bread. Again, when you visit different cities, you will see different type of bread. Bread is something important. Even if you don't have anything to eat, bread should be in your house, and you can bake it. You don't have to go and buy it. So wedding are also pretty famous in all family. Like, people usually get together, and up to 300 people attend one wedding. So they eat, they dance again, and you can see here this first picture on your left will be from 10th century, the wedding, and then how it's celebrated now, 21st century. Here you go, the food I was talking, pretty famous, and it takes time to cook and bake those food, but it's super delicious. Beşik toyu, one of the traditional, or like I would say one of the customs when the baby is born, they also celebrate it. They dance, they bring musicians, they celebrate if it's a boy, if it's a girl, they do different traditional, activities for their babies. Again, this is part of the culture, dancing, no matter where you are, music and dancing, food. So the second festival is Boysun Bahare, usually happens during spring in April, and it's very wild, I would say. We were talking about buffalo today and cowboys. So basically, during this time, you can go and watch nomad games. So it's called Kokpari, and it's terrifying. I don't like watching those. And the next one is Silk and Spice Festival. When you go to Bukhara, so Bukhara is one of the ancient cities as well, in May, you will find lots of different spices. And the faculty who went with me a couple of years ago, I was impressed how much they bought those spices to bring to the US. It was super interesting to watch. And the next one is, again, silk. So lots of local people, they produce silk and then they represent, and you can see by silk which silk is, related to which city. And this is what I was talking about. Shark Talanalare usually happens in August when it's windy, because usually I wouldn't recommend to go to Central Asia during summer. It's super hot, 120 degrees, and humid. It's humid as well. So as you can see, people from different countries come and they dance, they sing, and it's very beautiful. And people specifically try to go book their tickets like even 5 years in advance. And then the next festival is Handcrafter Festival. So it happens in Kakan. Kakan is one of the ancient cities as well. It's totally different in Fergana Valley. And I'm sure that historians or people who study history, Fergana is a totally, I would say, autonomous republic because it's different. Islam is developed differently than in Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan. So, and you can see that in all festivals, again, you will have shopping areas where you can come and buy, and then watch listen to the music and watch the dancers. And most of them are professional dancers. I'm not like that, but I'll try to today show you one of the elements, and I don't have to translate with my movements and with the items I will be using. You can understand what I'm dancing about. So that's it. That's part of my presentation. And the second part is dancing. Enjoy. Oh. Don't think it's so formal and unpopular country. If you love beer, we still have beer festival. It's not that fancy like in Europe probably. But yeah, we do have a beer festival, and we do have Chingan Extreme Festival, where you can go to the mountains. It's the area like Wyoming, and you will enjoy the mountains as well.
güzel Yazmaz yarını yanında gülse güzel Gül üzülse güzelmez şakıda gülse güzel Yazmaz yarını yanında gülse güzel Sultan bulup tahtı gel Ah koşulup ahtı gel Melikesin bahtı gel Binalar kısa güzel Sultan bulup tahtı gel Ah koşulup ahtı gel Melikesin bahtı gel Binalar kısa güzel Gül üzülse güzelmez Şakıda güzel güzel Yazmaz yarını yanında gülse güzel Yanında gülse güzel Acip çok sadal Çılsa hiçbir bir neva Arzuyunda gizli var Yürekten kısa güzel Acip çok sadal Çılsa hiçbir bir neva Arzuyunda gizli var Yürekten kısa güzel Gül üzülse güzelmez Şakıda güzel güzel Yazmaz yarını yanında gülse güzel Yanında gülse güzel Ağaylaşıp bülbülün Aşkar etip barsın Sus kalmay şirin şirin Hayaller sürse güzel Ağaylaşıp bülbülün Aşkar etip barsın Sus kalmay şirin şirin Hayaller sürse güzel Gül üzülse güzelmez Şakıda gülse güzel Yazmaz yarını yanında gülse güzel Gül üzülse güzelmez Şakıda gülse güzel Yazmaz yarını yanında gülse güzel Yanında gülse güzel
Das wie Seiten das Gut, aber hier auch
For those who will understand what was this music about.
Just guesses, any guesses?
Closer. Close.
I was just going to say it was very seductive.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I heard about that. I mentioned the object. So, anyone else want to get ready? Close. Not exactly.
engaging.
Flowers. I know. I took you further.
It's about flowers and how flowers are like women, how men should appreciate women, not only men but everybody. So, and it's a simile, flower to the woman. So, thank you. Okay, so we're going to get 3 chairs up here, I think, so that our speakers can come back and take some questions. And while they're getting ready and we're finding some chairs, I want to introduce you to a few additional people who are here. You can already tell that this is the most fun office of all campus, right, to work in. And of course, Isa and Dilnoza and I are all in that office. So is Mary Ann at the back table. And who else? Let's see.
But I want to introduce you to two people who lead projects in other parts of the world, because this year the Center for Global Studies has a number of cohorts that are really trying to build some momentum and accumulate colleagues and introduce colleagues to new parts of the world they may not be so familiar with, but where they can certainly explore it. So I want to introduce you to Arthur Zhu. I took him by surprise, right here, who's in kinesiology and health, and who works with the Shanghai University of Sport and Hong Kong as well. And we'll be bringing a conference here in a couple of years, actually all the way to Jackson Heights. You're going to pass through on the way, but nonetheless. But Arthur leads the cohort in China, so that if you'd like to talk more about China, introduce yourself to Arthur. And also to Rashmi Singh, who's working with the cohort focused on India, South Asia, and has a project out around the state trying to figure out the extent of Wyoming's international engagement. So another really good person to talk to. And so we got our 3 chairs, and I'm in the way. So, up you go. And we'll say this is a conversation. Please just feel free to shout out your questions and or things you'd like to just discuss, whatever. If you've got comments, please go ahead.
Lisa, I have a question for you. You were talking about how the Europeans were sending their best art to the United States, and I have a question about what exactly does best mean? Is this the art that they think will best show off Europe or European artists? Is this the art that will travel the best? Because I'm thinking there are an awful lot of paintings in Europe that they simply will not allow out of the museums because they don't travel. Is this art that they think that, given our low level of appreciation, that we could best appreciate? I mean, how do they define best?
Yeah, the answer is yes to all those things. But actually, one of the things I'm really interested in is how those questions evolved over time. So how the masterpieces of art were considered in 1876 versus in 1939. Some paintings came more than once. One of the things I'm hoping to be able to do is build a digital database so that I can actually track the circulation of these objects, not just to the World's Fairs exhibitions, but to other exhibitions. One of the things I'm sort of arguing or thinking happened is that it's really through their display, through being chosen to be displayed at these exhibitions, that they become masterpieces. There was no painting that wouldn't travel. The Mona Lisa came here in 1963, and people literally lined up around the block to view it in New York and other places as well. So some of the things we know today as masterpieces were considered masterpieces then, but also those tastes have changed. And then that question of bringing in the portrait of George Washington into a masterpieces exhibition was a very radical notion by 1939. So I think that what I will find is that the values of Western culture are pretty consistent through those, but what we'll see is that the masterpieces reflect changing tastes, not just in Europe, but in the United States, and the dialogue back and forth between what Americans liked and collected and what Europeans sent.
Following on that, in the 1939 fair, they had a contemporary exhibit. Were there written down rules that the judges used to determine what got in and what didn't?
Oh, those are fighting questions in 1939. There were 2 juries. There was a traditional realist jury and an abstract jury. There was regional representation. Remember, this is the time of the New Deal when we're really thinking a lot about what national culture is and what art is American and what American art means, and a lot of that was getting played out as they chose these artworks. So compromises were rampant, and yes, there was an interesting smattering of things, but in the end they decided not to make the modern artists compete with the realist artists, and there were multiple juries.
Because when you were talking about this, it just occurred to me about the timing with the World's Fairs and in the 1870s and the American Renaissance. So how much did the World's Fair, or did the World's Fair influence American artists during the American Renaissance?
Yes. You know, a lot of, that's a hard question to answer in terms of like regional schools and that kind of thing. I would say art historically, typically we think about World's Fairs influencing artists by representing non-Western art. So the standard story is that they went and saw African art, you know, in Paris in the 1880s, and then that completely changed Western art forever. In the United States, though, absolutely the exhibitions of American art in 1876 and 1893 in San Francisco in 1915, they were trying to define canons of art, and so artists were trying to put themselves in different boxes. I'm this kind of an American artist. The exhibition in San Francisco about the art exhibition in 1915 argued that it had a lot more influence than maybe we've seen because the influence was very realist, right? So there wasn't a lot of modern art influence in those exhibitions.
Different subject. I had the good fortune to be in Tashkent on May the 8th a number of years ago, and needless to say, it was a great celebration of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. And I wonder what impact that had on culture. The statistics that we heard, which were quite horrifying, were that 2 million people from Tashkent, which had a population of about 6 million,
6 million.
in those days, went off to war, went off to fight Hitler. And
Yes.
500,000 of them were women, and 500,000 never came back.
Exactly.
I mean, that must have had a huge impact on Uzbek culture.
That's why I love Wyoming. I see different people, and you know, like I hear things, and I'm like, wow, shocking. You know, you're absolutely right. And you know, that's where I feel like, you know, now being in most countries and I kind of traveling around the world, I just feel that Uzbekistan is more kind of a diverse country. We do, you know, because of the war and because what happened to us before the Second World War, we were taken by Persians, by Genghis Khan, Mongols, by Russians, everybody. So we're all like, you know, we're not Asian, but we're Asian, Central Asian. So I do feel that, you know, to answer your question, so at that time, it just reflected to our also people populations, and people left Uzbekistan, they went to Iran, for example, to live. And during the Second World War, because we didn't have enough men, we needed to help Russia. So they're our neighbors, right, and brothers. So we had to go, and most women, even though they were the one who were taking care of the kids, having 12 kids at a time or 15 kids, they were also going and fighting against Hitler. That time, yeah. So right now, though, I think we're doing pretty good. It's not. I wouldn't say that the, you know, birth is kind of like, you know, well, like we don't have two. I would say that, like, you know, 50-50 men and women. But it also doesn't mean that we are asking people not to have any more kids or, like, you know, to have more kids. So it's kind of it's growing, but in a natural way, I would say.
The other thing that I really wondered about was the whole historical experience in Uzbekistan. Of course, it was conquered by the Russians, but my understanding was the Russians didn't try to intervene in the culture.
Oh, yeah.
They left the local rulers in charge, and then in the 1920s, the communists came in, and they were full of piss and vinegar. They had veil-burning ceremonies in the central squares. Suddenly, women were allowed to go beyond, not just beyond the third grade, but were allowed to get PhDs.
Yes.
And it was really a radical change in the society. And I detected a certain, you know, quite a different attitude toward the communists than you'd find maybe in Lithuania or Latvia or someplace like that. They were, in many senses, they were welcome. And some of the younger generation are turning back to the traditional ways and wearing veils again and things like that. And their grandmothers are just mortified by that.
Yeah.
How hard they fought, to escape from that strict Islamic culture.
Yeah, I don't think that we're going back now. You will see more modernized women and people in Uzbekistan, and even like Tashkent, you will just see that it's kind of part of Europe. They're rebuilding, and then they're destroying the old buildings, which I don't like that idea. We should be who we are and keep everything. But going back to your question about the culture is a big term, and I'm glad that you clarified. If you talk about Russians, yes, Russians brought really good things about the education, like we can learn and continue doing. But also I think after Uzbekistan became independent in 1991, so we decided to keep our traditions, because Russian and Uzbek culture is totally different. Like even if you take even food and the way the language itself and traditions and customs and culture, everything is different. So I would say right now we see totally different, that it doesn't, I just don't understand what's going on, but we're trying to be Americanized today. So which I think it's kind of like different story. I don't want all of us to be Americans, but I think everybody has to have their own values and cultures, but maybe taking the right path and working toward that, which Russia now is not happy about that, right? So, but it definitely influenced a lot on people, and I think you're right. I would say I was surprised that 60% of ladies now have their PhDs in Uzbekistan. So, yeah.
And Tom, did you have a question?
No, actually, she followed up. To bring us to that last 30 years and the changes then I was going to ask you about. So since that got covered, I'll go over to the person who hasn't been addressed yet. And say, did Buffalo Bill ever get south of Rome? Because, much of the American immigration, especially right at that time, later to the 1890s, was from the south of Italy, from Sicilia and Basilica and Silicata and so forth. There is the real immigration. East Coast was southern Italy. Is there any impact there?
So he was in Naples now, and when he came back again in 1906, the first tour he was in 6 cities, and we went back. He went to 32 towns. He never really did go very far south, but in a sense it doesn't matter, because he generated so much popular interest in Buffalo Bill that the first translated dime novel of Buffalo Bill came out in 1890. Italians started writing Buffalo Bill stories, completely making stuff up. In about 1894, and it just generated such enthusiasm that these dime novels were found in every corner of Italy. And so they helped influence and spread the popularity. And again, the idea that coming to the American West was the promised land.
We have a question out here in what's a distant country on the green grass out there. So shout loudly so we can hear it and get you recorded.
For Lisa, with the World's Fairs, you know how, with the consumerism, how they had the souvenirs that people would get, like little pins and stuff with the 1939 one. Do you see that with the art exhibits, that they would get souvenirs, and that was kind of a way with public, and this because it applies to Buffalo Bill too, it kind of helps retain the public memory over time?
Yeah, so there were guidebooks to the art exhibitions, but the other interesting thing is a lot of the American artwork was for sale. So in Chicago in 1893, they had a gallery assistant there selling some of the artwork that was on display. So for American artists, it wasn't just all about abstract glory. Some of it was about selling the work. So also postcards, but mostly it was the guidebooks. And some of those were pretty glossy, and happily for the historian have complete lists of objects that were on display at the back of them. Yeah.
And I was just thinking that with connections with the big blockbusters, because you always have them.
Yeah, exactly. And I haven't found I mean, I stalk eBay sometimes, and usually it's the more iconic architectural things on those souvenirs. So if you find some, please send them my way.
Yeah, because I like to.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I think, was there a question behind Noah first? No, in that case, Noah, did you?
I have a question for Renee.
Okay.
Do we have any accounts of the Native Americans who traveled with Buffalo Bill to Italy? Did they feel like they were exploited? Were they well compensated? What is that perspective?
There's a lot of good literature on that, and it's become more and more popular. There's actually a really good book that came out just about 2 years ago. So Buffalo Bill, who had come to become famous as an Indian hunter, later realized that the Native Americans had really been, they'd gotten the short end of the stick, and he became very interested in protecting them and helping them out. So by taking them to his shows, he did two things. One of them, he gave them a good salary. He paid very fairly. And the other thing is he allowed them to perform their native dances, their native rituals that were forbidden by law in the United States. So Native Americans could not dance. That was prohibited. Actually, interesting story, it wasn't a law. They were just told and by the tribal agents that they could not dance. They could not have any of their ceremonies. And they were severely punished if they did. Buffalo Bill took them out and said, dance. Ride your horses, put on your regalia, and enjoy yourselves. And so the performers, the natives that traveled with him, by and large, were treated very well. They could send money home to their families, and it was a good experience for them.
He was hated by the Christian missionaries.
Yeah.
And that poses another question. Did any of the natives stay in Italy?
There's
About that?
no. So this is kind of funny. When Buffalo Bill took his shows to France and Germany, the Germans in particular adored the Native Americans. The French really liked them too. They have reenactments of Lakota, gatherings there. In Italy, the Italians went to the annex and they go, oh, no, these Indians aren't anything like what we read about. They're kind of icky. And the Indians went, ooh, these Italians, their food is much nicer than they are. And so the Italians really developed an affinity for the cowboys and not the Indians.
I hope you guys live right next to each other. You have a dinner party and talk about the intersectionality of what we're doing. It's super fascinating. And I really wish Laegreid would come back here for a couple of weeks and this time 5 weeks a year. Wherever you are, I grew up in West Alabama up here. This should be taken simple alumni. You guys are, you are amazing. This should be projected out there. Alumni embracing. I'm serious. I mean, notwithstanding the Centennial crowd, this is awesome. So I wanted to, I'm excited. So I'm looking at the exposition is, bringing the world in which course has changed. But it's so phenomenal. From the visceral and proximity matters. And Cody projecting out is such a thing that's which doesn't happen the same way now. Now then the Uzbeki, there's some diaspora, but it's usually in central, it's usually transboundary and music. It's just such a remarkable intersection of what you're all thinking about. I'm trying to put the question out of this, but it's just so thrilling to say, oh, let's go down to the studio and do it on public broadcasting. A couple things come out. One is with respect to the Italian cowboys, the Hawaiian cowboys, there's this book that some friends of mine Portland wrote called The Little Hog Rodeo about, you should write the book. It's the part of that. It's
they sort of ethnicity, and the Italian cowboys are equally compelling. That's it.
The Italian cowboys are amazing, and I was on sabbatical in Italy a year and a half ago. Seems like forever ago. Mm-hmm. And I spent my, people, oh, you're in Italy. What are you doing? I'm in a library and I'm translating books. But what I've tried to do is to get an objective history of the Buteri and go back as far as I can, because you find the same thing with the Italians as you see with the U.S. At different points of history, there are different interpretations of them. And so in the 1920s, the Buteri become very famous again because it's Mussolini, and he's looking to glorify the rural people of Italy, the workers. And this is where the article on Buffalo Bill, the Italian cowboy, because there was a dime novel that came out with Buffalo Bill as the Italian cowboy. It was a dime novel about him in the United States, but in the back there was an editor's note that said Buffalo Bill is Italian. He was born in Italy, and it gave it this entire completely fictitious backstory. Now there's people in Italy who still think he is Italian because they believe this, but he's been used for different reasons, until the present. In the 70s, Italian economy is doing better. People are starting to get tired of these American westerns that are coming over, and they're going to reassert the importance of their cowboys. So in the 70s, you get entirely different interpretation of Buteri. And in the 90s, you get another one, because now they're used as a foil against Buffalo Bill and Americans who are not environmentally friendly, against our political programs, and so it's really very fast.
Yeah, the quintessential appropriator became appropriated.
Absolutely, and that's why I think it's important. When Isa's looking at World's Fairs, it's not what happened at the World's Fair. It's really the important questions are what happened because of the World's Fair. What are some of the follow-ups? How did it influence culture or different groups of cultures in one way or the other? That's like your dancing, your culture. It's where did the dance come from? What does it represent? It's just not going to sing. It's not dancing. It's
well, thanks for being on.
Unfortunately, we've reached 6 o'clock, which is the end of our programming today. But I want to thank you all for coming, for sitting through not too many mosquitoes, and it's not cold and it didn't rain, so win-win-win. Plus, we really do think about how to put together our programs, and we're delighted that you had such a lot to talk about this afternoon. And by the way, if anybody does want to write us a check for the Centennial Scholars, right, which goes to support UW students in their international work. So seriously, nice lead-in. And Isa or I will be very happy. But anyway, I want to wrap up by saying I'm primarily in English, as many of you know, and I worked a lot recently on calendar customs, things like Robert Burns and so on. And we've heard about calendar customs today from Dilnoza about how people celebrate the progression of the year. And we've heard from Isa about the special events, right, that bring together lots of people. And from Renee about Buffalo Bill, who's kind of this peripatetic show, right? And I think what it brings home is that even right now, even when things are rough, somewhere in the world, somebody is having a really good time, and we can participate. I want to, just in closing, thank Sean, who is the maestro behind everything that happens today. So thank you, Sean. I want to remind you that on August 25th, we will be back, and it will be Thomas Rissa and Tanya Borzel and Jean Garrison talking about pandemics, but it'll be uplifting anyway because they're so exciting. And we also want to thank the Bare Bottom, and to remind you that if you would like to stay and have your dinner here, I'm sure they'll be very happy, or at any of Centennial's wine eateries. And then one last thing, we brought you a gift. I don't think I've got enough for everybody, so you'll just have to come back on August 25th. But we're so keen to get you back out in the world, we brought you some Global Engagement Office luggage tags. So please grab one on the way out. And thank you again so much for coming. We really appreciate it.